This sounds better. An audio engineering podcast for everyone.
Welcome back to the This Sounds Better podcast with Miles Walker, Jason Kingsland, and myself, Alex Tumay. As we wrap up season 1 of the This Sounds Better podcast, we are circling back through topics we opened but never closed. And what we're going to be talking about today is problems we face on a daily basis and how we solve them. One of them that people kind of deal with on a day-to-day basis as an engineer is file management, sending files, and missing files.
You know, I have a real simple thing about this whole problem, which is a major problem, and that's just get in touch with your producer. I don't think enough people really ask about what they're looking for before they start sending files. More and more as a mixer, I just get an email pop up in my thing, and it's just like, here's a link to your files. And I was like, I didn't even know I was mixing a song for you, man. And while I'm excited to have the work, then I have to start sorting through what they sent. And I'm like, okay, maybe some people send it printed with stuff. Some people send it dry. Some people send a rough mix. Some people did not. I don't even have a title on some of this stuff. So really, basically, anytime that's getting put in front of me, my first step is like, let me have a conversation with the producer. Let's talk about files. Let's talk about how they want to send them. Let's talk about what workstation they work in. And let's come up with something that makes sense for the way that I want. And I'm also understanding that the way I might want files could be different than someone else. So it's a real easy thing to just talk to the producer about the way they work and then figuring out how that's going to work for you and what you want to get for them. So just reach out to that producer, talk to them, get out in front of it.
And I'd add on to that, talk to the engineer, the tracking engineer. Something I've been doing lately, because tracking engineers are producers now. Vocal producers. There's not often a vocal producer in the room, especially in rap. And they're directing and they're doing a lot of the vocal treatment ahead of time. You know what I mean? And they're getting it in the ballpark. And their rough mixes really dictate where the song is going. And say there's certain plugins they use, like maybe there's a vocal missing because they didn't do a safe copy in and just dragged it over. So things like that are way more easily solved with someone that understands the engineering vocabulary really well. And so like getting the engineer's number and hitting them up has been something that really has been speeding up the process for me. And also, you know, there's a situation that I've gotten into a lot, which is the engineers that record the session take everything off when they send it to me.
I have been seeing that as well. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know who started that trend, but like,
they think that it protects themselves, which I will say this very clearly. No. You're not protecting your job. I don't want it. You're not protecting your mixes. You're not going to get, because I used to do something like that. I used to think that I was very, very good at my job when I first started, and that I hated being what felt like being replaced by a mixing engineer. But at the end of the day, I wasn't good enough at the time, and someone else should have mixed those songs. And what I was doing was just hurting my chances at ever getting a call back. And I stopped doing that. I started sending everything to the engineer.
Well, you know, another thing that you were hurting your chances of becoming part of a hit. Like, that's another thing I don't think other people think of is, you're right, they might be worrying about their position, but like, let me tell you, man, whether you mix a hit or whether you track a hit, you're on a hit record. And that's good for your career no matter what you did. And I don't understand why somebody would do anything in part of the record-making process that limits the chances for the record to be the best possible version. If you guys worked up a great rough mix and then the mixer can take it to the next level, that's great, but don't get in the way of that.
Well, and again, I think that the overwhelmingly important part about this is you as an engineer are here to help the artist, right? And there's a lot of factors involved with who's going to mix a record. And it may or may not be something as simple as just being that you're a good, talented mixer and you're capable of mixing the song. That may be very well true. There can be all kinds of crazy external factors that are weighing in on why they're going to pick another person to mix that project that's not you. And if you choose to collaborate with that person and you choose to be helpful, can be all the difference in even picking up other work. I've definitely had situations that I didn't get hired for the job, but that turned into other jobs just because I met that person.
Something I've been doing recently just to encourage the engineers I work with to send me everything that they did intact, or at least print what they did, is if the tracking engineer really did a lot of the vocal production and a lot of the mixing in the process, I don't mind giving co-mix credits if it makes the record better. Because like Miles was saying, I'm still part of a hit record. It's not about me. And I understand I was in their position once, and I very much empathize and sympathize with that, with being in that situation. But one thing that they need to understand is eventually you're going to be in my position, and someone's going to be doing this to you, and you're going to feel the way I'm feeling. And instead of hurting the record and instead of making everyone's lives harder in an attempt to kind of get yourself a mix, it's a lot better to just send everything as organized as you can, labeled in the right format with everything kind of correctly done, so that the record gets done better. And you might get someone like me who's like, give them co-mix credit, which I'm about to do on another record today.
In a lot of ways, I don't know if you guys do this, but as a mixer, what I do, and it sounds like, Miles, this may not be your world, because you were saying you just got shit showing up sometimes.
That happens a lot.
Yeah. That does not happen for me as much. I think it's just kind of baked into the process of the stuff I'm working on. But I have a one sheet that I put together that is basically
nice.
like, if you're sending from Pro Tools, here's how I want you to send it. If you're sending from Ableton, here's how I want you to send it. If you're sending from Logic, here's how I want you to send it. And I have little screen grabs of like the displays that I want you to check in the boxes and just make sure it looks like this. And I update it every 18 months, every 2 years, something like that, just so that if there's new functions and whatever other DAW that's there. And even at the end of it, I include, if this is too much for you, get in touch with me immediately and I can set up. And I've done this a lot. There's a program called TeamViewer that allows you to screen share another person's computer so you can effectively control their system. I can take a TeamViewer with this person and then in turn be able to look at their system and walk them through it in real time, or have one of my assistants do it, or whatever's going to make it easy. And I try to make that a point of service for my clients.
I'm absolutely with that idea too. When you make it easier for them, you're helping the process right along. I mean, of course you're helping yourself, and it's going to be easier for you when it's time to mix, but you're just helping the experience. And I think that's a great way to do it. The TeamViewer idea is great. Another thing I do a lot, especially because I work with a lot of producer artists in the dance world, I just say, send me the whole session, man. I was like, don't even worry about the stems. I'll take care of that. So, it does require a familiarity with the other DAWs, which I have now because of doing it this way, but I really just want to make it easy on them. And I think that's a great approach, Jason.
So I work a lot with Kenny Beats, who works in Ableton only, and he records all of his artists and he produces all the beats. And what he ends up doing, and has actually worked really well for us, and mostly because he trusts me to just do whatever I feel will be best, is he sends me dry everything with just the demo. Like, I make the cuts in the same way he made the beat cuts, which, is tedious, but it also ends up with getting I have a little bit more freedom to do a little bit more stuff in the beat, and because I have the entire beat untouched. And then I also get just raw, dry vocals, so I can re-auto-tune them and get them kind of in the zone that I feel is best. And that it only really works for our situation. I wouldn't do it with a lot of my other clients, but it's been a really interesting workflow for us.
A lot of times what I've done, at least for Ableton and Logic stuff, because I get a lot of stuff that's coming out of those platforms, is I'll ask them to make the stems if they can, and I'll also ask them to send the session from that DAW. Right. And then if there's an issue, and I think, Miles, you do something like this. If there's an issue, I can always go back to the session and say, hey, I need to take this reverb out. I need to change the distortion in some way, because now that I'm mixing it, the source file isn't there. But I like to, as much as possible, start with their session and then make adjustments. But it sounds like, you know, the way that you're working with Kenny, Alex, is that you've kind of got that built in and you guys are sharing those stems in that way.
I mean, I think it just goes to the original point of like whatever works for your process. That works for Alex's process with Kenny, but it might not work for his process with somebody else. And anytime you can just have the conversation, as soon as those files come in, you can set the guidelines of like what that record is going to be like. You know, you might still run into pitfalls this way, like coming across, if you get a session, plugins you don't have, or maybe they didn't freeze it. So, you know, that's worth talking about with the producer too, is be like, hey man, you know, I'm looking at the session and, I don't have your synth library and you're using your own sample bank. You know, you're going to have to like flatten and freeze that file for me. And, you know, having a familiarity with that kind of stuff can be very helpful when you're talking about how it's going to work.
In a similar vein, I mean, I have a lot of plugins, don't get me wrong, but I'm definitely missing a lot of the boutique joints. And I worked with Redacted, which I'm just going to say Redacted because I can't say who it is, recently. And their engineer called me before they sent anything. They took the initiative and called me. And they were like, what plugins do you have? Because I use some crazy shit. And I was like, I got UAD, Waves, I got, you know, Antares, I got Sound Toys, I got Slate. And he was like, well, I use this. And I was like, cool. Can you just take that entire track and just commit it for me and leave it there, but commit it? And if I feel like I need to go buy the plugin, I will. But if I feel like I can work with what you sent, I'm going to do that. And luckily enough for me, this engineer is like killer and everything sounded great. And like I got great quality vocals and like the effects were really creative and well done. And so I was able to just build on top of that as opposed to erasing it all and starting over, which is always a bummer because as good as an engineer as I feel like I am, and I know you guys probably feel the same way, recreating what someone else did from scratch is always not fun.
I think that there's actually a really interesting thing that's going to happen here is like, this is kind of the return of like the old model of recording as like a mixer, you know, in that like, personally, I want less options. I'm not a big fan of like having tons of alternate takes or like access to infinite amounts of variables or just trying to redo work that's already been done. You know, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And I think that there's a lot to be said for, like there was a point in the middle 2000s, I remember, where everyone wanted their sessions pretty fucking clean. And everyone was working their nuts off, trying to sweat to get back to where the rough was. And I don't think anyone's interested in that anymore. I'm not. I want to be able to pull up the faders and be exactly where you were at. And like, just pretend like this is how the song was recorded. I don't give a shit what's in the inserts. This is the thing.
I think when we're talking about the purpose of a song and where it needs to go, starting from zero again is a really good way to lower the ceiling of a song's potential. Whereas if you get a session with the rough mix and maybe you have to import new stems because it's on a 2-track, but the vocals are processed in the way and they still have the same delay. Because I'll tell you one thing, if you take off a rapper's delay, it's over. It's over. You're not getting that mix. You're not, they're just gonna go find someone else if you change the main delay that's going throughout the song. But when you have those kind of elements already together, now you can say, how do I enhance what's already here? And now, instead of being at a level that's kind of like good, you're able to elevate the song even more.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was talking about when people, and when you were saying engineers remove their thing, I was like, you just lower the ceiling on the potential for the record.
Yeah.
And like, wouldn't it be so much more exciting if we were working as hard as we all could to make this a hit as opposed to covering stuff up? You know, and once you have those settings, you can concentrate on other things that are in there, not worrying about chasing them back. Like, what's the sound like? What's the recording quality like? How can I work with that?
Well, and I think the weird thing about some of that too is that like, this is your work that you've put into the track to make it better, to make it sound more like what the artist wants and what you think is right. And so like when you don't pass that information along to the mixer, like, it sends a really funny message, and I understand what it is, but there's not really a good reason for doing it.
I think in this industry, in the way that money is dispersed to mixers and recording engineers, etc., and the need to kind of get all the money you can while you can in this industry, especially because, you know, careers are a little shorter for certain artists or whatever it may be. And like the money is shorter compared to like, you know, 2003, 4, 5, etc., or even the 90s. There's this need for engineers to kind of get as much as they can out of every song, or this feeling that you need to. And I don't really fault tracking engineers for doing this, for taking all their processing off. But I will say it comes from the wrong, it comes from the wrong place. Cause what you think you're doing is actually not what you're doing. Cause everybody who's working on the song sees what you just did as a move for you and not a move for us as a group. Because that's what you are. You're a team. You know what I mean? You're just passing the ball to someone else on the team. And if you're going to do that, you should do it in the best way you can instead of, you know, kind of fumbling it our way on purpose so that we get tackled and, you know, look bad. You want to make us look good because, like I've said on previous episodes, anytime a recording engineer sends me something good, the first thing I do is either tell my manager, or if I have a good relationship with the A&R or a good relationship with the artist, to never let that engineer get away from them. First thing, I'm not trying to, you know, retroactively take your tracking job, or I'm not trying to forever take all of your mix opportunities from you. I was just called this time to do a job.
Well, I think that there's a good point that you're bringing up with this. Is you're getting around to what is the intention of the project. And when people do that, you're taking away from the intention of what that project is. And so much of this, like how often are you spending time with producers or artists trying to figure out what they want it to be?
I mean, that's most of the mixing process for me, really, is just getting on the same page. Like last night I mixed a handful of records for one artist. In the first batch, I did less and they were happier. And the second batch, I was like, I'm going to fucking smash these. And I went overboard with the vocal effects, with the post-production, with thinking that I had their idea for the song correct at this point, and I could really go for it now. And the first messages I woke up this morning were, can you undo all that stuff you did to the song to make it different? Because what we sent you was what we liked about the song. So what we have now is just kind of your version of the song, which is, you know, interesting and cool, but it's not what we want. And I was like, okay, cool. Send me the demos again. I listened to the demos this morning, and then I came here for the podcast, and now another day is going to be spent on these songs when I could have just taken a little bit of a step back and maybe even asked a question, and I get a whole day of my life back.
Right. And I think in a lot of ways, like that's where you start to get into like the very like mature end of like mixing records, is being like, I'm looking for the fastest way to get this done for everybody. Like I may have an occasional strong opinion on something, but like it's not my record. It's the producer's record. It's the artist's record. And I can throw my idea at them and hope for the best, but let me be the smart guy and just get it done.
Sometimes that perspective is what they're really coming to you for. Like they are very happy with where the record is, just like Alex was saying, but they just want, just in case they're missing on that one thing. And you've heard so many records and you've done so many things as a mix engineer that you're going to catch that one thing that they missed, but they're not looking for like a top down rebuild. And sometimes, you know, as a mixer who's been doing it for a while, that's when you got to be like, I feel like really they just want me to give it the overview and connect with what's already there, not hit the reset button. And that perspective is often what they're coming to you for.
One way that I solve this problem, because I did it last night when I was working on these songs to make sure that if I went too far, it was easy to go back, is when I'm doing that one extra thing and when I'm making that one extra effect that, you know, might change the song for the better or might be something they don't like, or really like kind of like really put like myself into the song. I always do it on an aux and I label it, or I put it at the end of a chain so that if I need to undo it, it doesn't fully change my mix. Because I know anytime you take a risk, you should be able to undo it very quickly. And that's one of the great things about, Pro Tools and DAWs in general is you can always go back. Nothing's permanent. There's always a way back. You know what I mean? And so to solve that problem for me, it's like I put it at the end of the chain, or I put it on an aux that I could easily just make inactive, and then I'm right back to where the original view of the song was.
That said, where things are permanent versus not, how do you guys deal with things that like are problems with that? Like, for instance, like, does anyone remember that like really sweet time where like Sound Toys lost its settings if anyone was on a slightly different version from you?
Yep.
Specifically version, you mean they were on the crack and you had the legit version?
Yeah.
Is what you really mean right there.
So, cause I know exactly what Miles is talking about, cause I had the cracks. And the cracks just in general, I just had the audio suite.
Oh,
cause
right.
like
So you just rendered it
in
all
general,
down.
if you use Sound Toys and you put it on, like if you put the decapitator on something and then you close your session and reopened it and you had the crack, certain cracks would just be like, nope, that's it. You start over, put it back. And so I would be screenshotting all my Sound Toys, and every time I had to do a recall, would have to like re-input all of the settings.
Man, buying that plugin just so much cheaper than all the time you burnt up.
And for everybody listening, I think all three of us endorse Sound Toys as a plugin company, not in any official stature, but it's only like $500. Go get it. It's so worth it. I would say like of like the bang for your buck plugins, it's so worth it.
Yeah, especially for color-based plugins. I mean, like, that's how you can do some really creative stuff with, like, the delays and the saturators and, even the more obscure stuff like the tremolators and the crystallizers. You can come up with some weird stuff in a very fun and creative way with that stuff.
I mean, actually, one of my favorite uses for Sound Toys is taking and putting Echo Boy on 0 seconds or 0 milliseconds delay time, and then using the delay algorithms to act as like a filter or lo-fiing device.
You know what's interesting is sometimes I like it for its distortion, but not like the harmonic distortion, just overdriving the input and using the wet dry that way too, because it has a really nice breakup on like the filter freak.
Yeah.
Totally esoteric stuff that you don't think about, but you can get in there with those plugins because they're coded really well, and they give you a lot of parameters if you want to deep dive.
Do it all the time.
So speaking of plugins, what do you guys do when you get a session and you don't own the plugin?
Demo that shit.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, at this point, I make sure I just stay up to date with all the ones and pick them up if people like using them. But I do know what you're saying about sometimes it might be a plugin that's new to you and you want it to work for the session. I think the best thing you can do is check out the manufacturer's demo status, find out a little bit about that. Does the demo recall settings from an authorized version of the plugin? Figure out if you can download that to your iLock, render off whatever you need to render to. I mean, there's basically some good options out there to try and keep that compatibility going if it's important to you.
I think for me, what it comes down to is what the plugin's functionality is and how important it is to the sound. Because obviously, it'd be great to be able to buy every plugin that comes in on a session that I may or may not have. But that is a lot of money. A lot of money I don't have. So what I end up doing is, kind of making, like a compromise where if it's like an effect or if it really feels integral to the vocal sound, I'm going to go buy it. But if it's something like a compressor that, I might have the Waves version or the UAD version, I feel like I can match their settings just by listening, then I'm going to go do that. But if it's some sort of like esoteric thing that's going to really bring the song together, like some sort of tape or some sort of like the Valhalla reverbs, like there's just not a lot of stuff that sounds like that, and you just kind of got to go with it. You know what I mean?
I mean, one thing I actually think is really exciting, at least for me, is a mixer, because a mixer is like the most isolated job. I like getting other people's stuff in that have other plugins in, because it actually opens my eyes to what's out there. Because sometimes if it's just not in my purview, like I'm not fucking paying attention and like going and seeking out new stuff. So like almost everything, I'm going to at least check out what their setting is with their product if it's easy and doable. Just because it gives you something to learn about and like look at their settings and how they were thinking about it. And you can also see if it's a bad recording.
Ooh.
How they were fucking it up, which to me is kind of important.
Oh, absolutely. Sometimes they've masked with whatever plugin a really poorly recorded vocal or really poorly recorded part, and it's up to you to either leave what they did covering it up or try and perform surgery all over again on the body and hope for a better result.
Or, I mean, like if they've fucked it up in a way that they now like it, which I come across this a lot, then you have to like kind of like look at the way in which they're fucking it up. And if there's maybe a slightly better, like if you need a lesser version of it, like I like being able to see the way that they're doing it and try and figure out like, well, can I cut a compromise here? Is there a wet dry blend on this plug that I don't know about? Whatever. And start working on how to get the sound in a way that I think is maybe going to be a little bit more palatable for the track, but retains the identity that they like about the sound.
There's some really tricky ones too, like distortion. If they were using distortion to cover up a bad recording, you always got to be like, ooh, now this seems like a songwriting choice because I'm not sure we're going to be able to declip this back to a clean, pristine take. So sometimes they're like creative choices that end up being functional choices.
Yep.
And you just gotta ride that one out.
I think when it comes to like distortion not on purpose, where it's like, oh, it's just clipping momentarily and you have digital clipping and it's something that's just like baked into the vocal track and it's forever there fucking up just certain moments of the track, you really have to lean into the distortion. And that's really the solution. Like you see it a lot on tracks nowadays where you're like, why would they ever do this to the vocal? And it's because they got such a wonky vocal take that was the way to make it consistent. Because at the end of the day, it's like a consistent vocal, even if it's consistently distorted, is better than a vocal that just momentarily clips for a second and really takes you out of the song.
I mean, I deal with a lot of like distorting stuff and trying to find like artistic ways of dealing with fidelity, you know, like where there's maybe less of a metric of like, this is good or this is bad, like to this person, like, dude, I was really into a 1961 Tropicalia record where it was like an Ampex tape deck that was kind of broken and they were semi-driving the input the entire time. And to then like that sonic perfection, you're just going like, fuck. Yeah, I guess I'll figure out how to get you to this like super specific taste metric that you've developed. But like equal to that, I think that finding ways of being able to look at what their settings are and then find ways of getting creative with it. Because one thing I think that you can do with even a poorly recorded vocal, like if you've got stuff that's like kind of clipping, there are things that will mask that clipping. Sometimes it's more distortion. I found some other things, like there's a record I was working on 3 or 4 years ago, that had some really bad, just like, it was some type of John Hardy or like 990 based mic amp, that the singer clipped like twice in the song. And I think those are the things you're talking about, Alex, where like that sounds real chump when something clips like on just the loud note, you know, and you're just like, come on, like you should have gotten that better. But what I ended up doing for some of that was, have you guys ever used the isotope declipper? I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, that's what when I literally said declip, I was thinking about the isotope, the RX6 declipper. Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of.
Do you use that, Alex?
I have before, but I feel like the level of unsalvageability I've been downplaying a little. Cause the vocals that I get sound like, you know, they've been through a blender sometimes. And then sometimes the best way to fix that is to throw like Decapitator or Devil Lock on it and just fucking crank it and then treat that like the vocal now. Treat that like it's the dry vocal and make that your 0 point, you know? It's just sometimes like that is the best way to maintain the energy and the feeling of it without, you know, stripping it of all its character, because like at that point, that's the track that they liked, you know?
Sometimes one real quick trick I can throw in for me, and it may not be applicable for what you guys are doing, but specifically with the style of music that I'm working with a lot of times, I will find somewhere to put that distortion, but it may not be the actual dry lead vocal. And so even if the vocal is semi-distorted and like poorly recorded, like I was working on something just recently where like they still wanted it to feel cleaner, but keep the attitude of the distortion, which is like a really hard thing to get to. But like what I think I ended up doing was like using like, it was Valhalla Room, I think, and just like some type of really short, weird reverb that I like cranked Devilock just way the fuck up on. And it sounded weird. Like it sounded pretty crazy, but it was great for the song. And it kind of let them feel that distortion while there's still being some of the articulation and the clarity and the, vibe of having a clean vocal, and it kind of masked when there wasn't as clean of a vocal in the dry, if that makes sense.
You can totally do the same thing with like a quarter note delay, because if you have like a dry vocal, but then a very more distorted echo, the ear kind of perceives it coming in and out, and it's like, wait, well, was the dry really that clean? And when you hit a bad note, you're like, oh, that must just be the echo from the quarter note before kind of covering it up. And you're like, no, that's definitely the recording, dog, but glad you didn't notice. And, you know, it actually works for the creative sake. There's a really great reverb on the Manny reverb, a preset called like Indie Verb or something like that. And it's got that element that you're talking about with like a really heavily distorted reverb sound. And it can be super useful for creating that interesting distorted space, even if you're still going for a dry sound on top. That's a good one.
Yep.
I think like making a mistake a moment is such a like undervalued technique, which is kind of what Miles was talking about. It's like sometimes you can just turn that mistake into something amazing and something that really makes the song a little bit better. In the Bob Ross kind of thought process. There are no mistakes. Just happy accidents, man.
Just happy trees, bro.
Yeah, consummate V's, dude.
And I think adaptability is such a strong trait of a good engineer, and it's such a good way to figure out problems. It's just being able to adapt to the situation and make the best of it in your own little Bob Rossi type way, just to bring him back for a second. And so if there's anything that you should really take away from this, other than, you know, don't fuck up the session for the mix engineer, if there's anything to take away from this, it's learn how to adapt and learn how to compromise with the session itself so that you can get to the final result that you can most be proud of. So for the This Sounds Better podcast, this is Alex Tumay, Jason Kingsland, and Miles Walker.